Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, defining turning point in history, how the United States totally transformed from a fairly isolationist republic into a bona fide global superpower back in the 1890s. We're going to break down the sources and uncover the real facts behind this monumental shift.
So here's the big question we're tackling today. Was America's global empire an accident or a deliberate design? You see, before 1890, America's stance was essentially defensive and, honestly, largely isolationist. The main focus was keeping the New World completely free of messy European diplomatic entanglements, not exactly conquering the globe. And that makes this sudden, rapid shift to global expansion in the late 19th century a genuinely fascinating historical mystery. Did the US just clumsily stumble into world dominance, or was this a highly calculated move? Let's find out.
Section 1. The shift to expansion.
To really grasp this shift, we first need to look at the absolute driving force of the era, which was imperialism. At the time, European powers were aggressively carving up the globe. They were hunting for prestige, raw materials, and fresh markets. The British, for instance, openly boasted about bringing Christianity and civilization to their territories. Watching all of this unfold, some Americans started to believe that, hey, to survive and compete economically, the United States desperately needed to follow suit.
This new intellectual push for expansion was perfectly captured by Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was a naval officer and theorist, and his 1890 book literally revolutionized U.S. policy. Mahan actually collaborated closely with Theodore Roosevelt, and he argued that maritime bases like Hawaii, for example, were absolutely imperative for America's economic survival and for commanding the Pacific. So, what was actually driving this sudden outward look? Well, it was a pretty volatile mix of motivations. Industrial capitalism was booming, which meant they desperately needed new overseas markets to sell all those goods. Plus, the domestic frontier was officially deemed closed, meaning folks felt they needed new horizons for that classic American dynamism. You add in a desire for a stronger navy, rising problematic notions of cultural superiority, and a real fear of a rapidly modernizing Japan, you basically have the exact blueprint for an expansionist ideology.
And this ideology, it had some incredibly powerful champions. Theodore Roosevelt really highlights this new breed of upper-class, Harvard-educated patricians who viewed expansion kind of on the British model as a necessary test of national character. For leaders like Roosevelt, failing to expand meant losing out to bolder nations. It meant forfeiting America's rightful place among the great powers of the world. Section 2. Sparking the War. The actual spark that turned these expansionist dreams into reality happened just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In 1895, a massive rebellion erupted in Cuba against Spanish rule, led by the nationalist José Martí. Now, the Spanish army responded with incredibly brutal methods to crush the revolt. But why did America care so much? Well, Cuba's major trading partner and investor was actually the United States, not Spain. With major U.S. tobacco and sugar investments directly threatened, American commercial interests grew very, very alarmed. Right at this moment, enter a brand new media phenomenon, the yellow press. Think of this as the 1890s equivalent of clickbait. Powerful publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer deliberately manipulated these events in Cuba. They hyped up the conflict with sensationalist reporting just to sell more newspapers. And in the process, they whipped the American public into a hysterical frenzy demanding intervention. Then came the perfect pretext. In February 1898, the American battleship USS Maine, which President McKinley had sent down to Havana Harbor, mysteriously exploded, tragically killing 266 crew members. The Spanish claimed it was an internal coal fire, which, by the way, later modern investigations actually proved was the most likely cause. But the American press instantly and very loudly accused the Spanish of sabotage by an underwater mine. The clamor for war became deafening, giving McKinley a very convenient excuse to act. Section 3. Defeating Spain.
The conflict that followed was remarkably swift. We're talking about a war unfolding across two completely different theaters, the Caribbean and the Pacific. Following the official declaration of war in April, Admiral Dewey's Pacific Squadron sailed right into Manila Bay and completely destroyed the outdated Spanish fleet in May. By summer, American troops landed in Cuba, and the Spanish forces surrendered after just 17 days of ground fighting. Despite some pretty poor U.S. Army organization and a severe lack of training for all those hastily enlisted volunteers, America's vastly superior Navy secured a fast, decisive victory.
But as you might guess, this swift victory was deeply polarizing back home. Secretary of State John Hay famously and rather cheerily celebrated it as a splendid little war. On the flip side, author Sherwood Anderson offered a much darker perspective. He viewed the crushing defeat of a drastically weakened, crumbling Spanish Empire as less of a heroic victory and more of a dishonorable theft. So, the dust settles, and the 1898 Treaty of Paris completely rewrites the global map. Almost overnight, the United States effectively swallowed Spain's empire. They gained Puerto Rico and Guam, they bought the Philippines for $20 million, and they ensured heavy, lasting influence over a supposedly independent Cuba. Oh, and they simultaneously annexed the independent islands of Hawaii for good measure. Just like that, America suddenly possessed the exact Pacific and Caribbean maritime bases it needed to project massive global power.
Section 4. The Philippine-American Conflict.
Now, these new possessions came with severe complications, and the situation in the Philippines was especially fraught. See, the Filipinos naturally assumed the Americans were liberators. They had absolutely no idea they were simply exchanging one imperial overlord for another. But America quickly realized it wanted to keep the Philippines as a permanent forward base in the Pacific, partially just to keep an eye on rival nations like Germany, who might try to snatch up those former Spanish colonies if the U.S. left.
This misunderstanding led to a truly tragic sequence of events. The Filipino rebel leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, had actually cooperated with the U.S. Navy to liberate the islands from Spain in the first place. But when it became blindingly clear that the U.S. was breaking its promises of independence, Aguinaldo launched the Filipino Revolt in February 1899 against the American occupation. The resulting Philippine-American War was brutal. It dragged on for 3 years, cost far more lives than the initial war with Spain, and required massive military action to suppress. To justify this bloody, drawn-out occupation to the folks back home, President McKinley relied on some deeply paternalistic rhetoric. He claimed the U.S. was on a quote-unquote civilizing mission to convert the Filipinos to Christianity. The profound irony here? The vast majority of Filipinos had already been practicing Catholics for generations under Spanish rule. This immense disconnect revealed a lot about the imperial mindset and sparked tremendous controversy back in America.
Section 5. The anti-imperialist pushback. All of this violence, racial prejudice, and apparent betrayal of democratic ideals led to a massive domestic backlash. The fierce debate essentially split the country's most prominent figures right down the middle. On one side, imperialists like Roosevelt, Mahan, and Henry Cabot Lodge stressed the absolute necessity of global power and new markets. On the other side, you had the Anti-Imperialist League. Formed in 1898, this was an incredibly strange and unlikely coalition. You had pacifists like William Jennings Bryan teaming up with industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie, and even the legendary author Mark Twain, all uniting to stress morality and Republican ideals over global conquest.
Their argument was rooted in the very core of America's identity. Take this quote from William Jennings Bryan during the 1900 presidential election. He powerfully argued that acquiring an empire fundamentally betrayed the traditions of America's founding fathers. The anti-imperialists truly felt that forced colonization completely contradicted the core belief in self-governance, the very foundation the American Republic was built upon.
But despite those fierce protests from the Anti-Imperialist League, the expansionists ultimately won out. The U.S. government moved swiftly to officially cement its new status on the world stage. In 1901, Congress passed the Platt Amendment, this legally authorized intervention in Cuba, virtually making it an American protectorate. More broadly, it became a tool to justify future American military and economic interventions across Latin America for years to come. The American empire was now formally codified into law. So as we wrap up this explainer, we've got to return to that core mystery from the 1890s. We've seen how economic pressure, sensationalist media, strategic naval theory, and one splendid little war created a superpower almost overnight. But as you look back at this history, ask yourself, was this leap into global empire simply an unavoidable accident of history brought on by a sinking ship and unstable global markets? Or was it a deliberate, calculated pursuit of global domination that permanently altered the nation's foundational ideals? It's a debate that didn't just define the turn of the 20th century. It's a debate that absolutely shaped the modern world we live in today.